Hey guys, welcome back to Builds by Maz. Today I'll be showing you how you can make your own custom textured artwork. This is a great way to add large-scale art to your home while saving yourself a ton of money. And the best part is, you can customize it however you like. Let's get started. Instead of using canvas, we started off with 1/4-inch plywood as our base. It's much cheaper and easier to customize. We held it up to the wall to determine what size we wanted, and ended up going with 3 feet by 5.5 feet. Regular spackling compound acted as our medium, and we used some basic putty knives and a trowel to just spread it along the board. This spackling is naturally very thick, and this is what's going to give it such easy texture. And even though it looks like bubblegum, make sure you don't eat it. The reason this spackling is pink is because it's a special formula that dries white, so that you know when it's ready to be sanded. We didn't really have a plan for this, so we started off with just covering the entire plywood sheet, giving it an initial base layer. After everything was covered, we started going back through everything, being more mindful of the textures we were applying. This is where you can really be creative and use whatever style you like, whether it's swirls, patterns, or just random chaos, which is kind of what we were doing. Make sure you work quickly though, because even though this takes a while to fully dry, it does start to harden up and become less workable after just a few minutes. This takes a ton of spackling, and you can see that we almost finished this entire gallon-sized bucket. Here's how everything looked immediately after all the spackling was applied. And then you can see a bit later, after things are starting to dry up, you can see all these white spots. And here's a close-up of the texture when it was almost fully dried. For the border, I bought some 1x3 common boards. My plan was to cut a channel along the length of each one. I adjusted my table saw blade so it was only going about 1/4 inch into the wood. I ran this board through the saw and it cut out a small channel along the inside. This is going to be used to slide the 1/4 inch plywood along, creating a nice, strong, and clean border. I did the same with the rest of the lumber to be used for the border. However, one pass with each wasn't enough. Since the table saw blade's only 1/8 of an inch thick, I needed to do 2 side-by-side cuts to be able to fit the 1/4 inch plywood. After a minor adjustment to my table saw, I ran the piece of lumber back through it. This second pass widened up the channel, as you can see here. I used a test piece of 1/4 inch plywood just to make sure that this gap was the correct width, and everything fit perfectly. One big mistake I made was I didn't leave a border around the edges to leave room for these frames to slide onto, and the extra spackling had to get scraped away. Luckily I realized this before it was fully dried, and it was pretty easy to scrape off about a centimeter gap around the border of the plywood. I then started cutting my framing lumber at 45-degree angles to prepare them for the miter joints. When you're measuring out your cuts, it's important not to use this outside line, but rather the inside line where the joints are actually going to be touching. I completed each edge one at a time, sliding it into place and making sure that it was the correct length. This was a little tricky to do as a dry run because I had to hold everything in place without any glue. So with some help, we got it lifted up and were able to measure out all 4 edges, making sure that this frame was going to be a snug fit. One thing I didn't expect was just how flimsy this whole thing was. I didn't account for how heavy the spackling would be, and the frames on its own wasn't enough to hold this thing sturdy. So we ended up cutting out a support piece and gluing it to the back side of the 1/4 inch plywood, giving it some more structure. If I was to do this again, I would build out the whole frame first before doing the spackling. This was much more difficult with the artwork already complete, and these weights and clamps did end up leaving some indentations. Here's a good view of one of the clamp marks here. Really not a huge deal in the end, especially since this is just abstract art. It was pretty easy to repair, but just something that we could have avoided if we'd done things in a different order. This was also a good time to look for any cracks that may have occurred while the spackling was drying. You can see a little one here, and I looked all over the artwork and just patched them up easily. With some leftover lumber, I tested out a bunch of different stain colors that I had on hand, and we ended up choosing this special walnut. We liked the tone of this color a lot, but wanted to see how it would look like if it was a little bit lighter. One way that you can lighten up your stains is to just mix some with some regular mineral spirits. This will dilute the stain a little bit, giving you a lighter version of the original color. We did end up liking that lighter version of this color, so I went ahead and stained all 4 edges of the frame. As always, it's important to wipe off any excess stain before it dries to make sure that you get a good, even coat without any splotching. I then followed that up with some clear satin polyurethane, which will give the frame a protective finishing coat. This liquid kind that you brush on works great and is very economical, but I like to finish off with a spray version. I find that it just gives a really nice top coat. We also tested out painting the spackling, but in the end we kind of liked the natural off-white color, so we just left it as it is. Using the blow function on my shop vac, I got rid of any dust or debris that was remaining on the surface of the art. I then gave the whole thing a couple coats of this matte, clear coat protective spray. I thought it'd be good to use some kind of finish since we didn't utilize paint. And here's a close-up of the completed surface of the art. The final step was to assemble the frame. I ran a bead of wood glue inside these channels, starting with the bottom piece. We stood the plywood upright in it, and then attached the sides. We utilized brackets and screws just to hold it together while all this glue is drying. Lastly, we added this top piece. I held it in place with some corner clamps, and we let everything be overnight. This thing was pretty heavy, so I wanted to make sure that it was screwed into some studs in the wall. So I marked out where a couple of them were, and then drilled 3-inch screws into the studs, leaving about a 1/2 inch sticking out from the drywall. Once I knew it was level, I was able to just hang it onto these screws to mount it, and then this art project was done. And here's the finished product. Not only did this save us a ton of money, it was super fun to make, and we love the way that it turned out. Getting large pieces of art can cost hundreds of dollars, and this is a great alternative and something that anybody can do. Hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time.